Welcome back to Intuition. You know, the key to learning and mastering any skill is to work on the fundamentals. In today's video, we're going to be going over fractions for beginners. Stay tuned. Okay, so if you're learning fractions now, or if you've been introduced to fractions in the past, you've probably learned that a fraction is part of a whole, right? That's probably what you've learned in the past. Well, I don't really like that definition because it's not broad enough of a definition for me, because a fraction being part of a whole is just one application of a fraction. A fraction can represent a lot of other things. For example, a fraction could be a probability. Can you have a whole probability? You know, a fraction could be a speed. It could be a rate, right? So a fraction could be a lot of other things besides just being a fraction of a pie or a fraction of a pizza, right? Even though, yeah, fraction does have applications in that area, but a fraction is actually broader than that. So with that said, how should we think about fractions? Well, I like this definition of a fraction. This is my definition of a fraction, right? A fraction is a number that is less than 1 and can be written in terms of whole numbers. All right? Easy. Simple definition. Now, let's take a look at that definition and apply it to actual fraction to see exactly what that definition means. Okay, so first of all, it says that a fraction is a number, okay? So that's what you want to think about a fraction. You don't have to think about pies or pizzas or anything. Just know that a fraction is just a number. Just like what? Just like the number 1. The number 1 is probably the first number you learned when you learn how to count as a kid. So all you have to do is just compare a fraction to the number 1. And that's all you got to do, right? So if a fraction is a number and the number 1 is a number, how do they compare to each other? Well, that goes to the second part of the definition. The second part of the definition says that a fraction can be written in terms of whole numbers. Okay, so a fraction has a numerator and a denominator, and the numerator and the denominator are whole numbers. Now we know what a fraction looks like. Now let's take a look at what a fraction means. The denominator tells you how much smaller the number is than the number 1. Right? Remember, you always want to compare a fraction or any number for that matter. You always want to compare any number to the number 1. So when you take a look at a fraction, the denominator tells you how much smaller that number is than the number 1. So for example, the fraction 1/3, that's 1 divided by 3. So you have 3 in the denominator. So that tells you that, hey, this number is 3 times smaller than 1, right? And how many of these numbers do you have? You have 1 of them. That's what the numerator tells you. So the denominator tells you how small the number is. The numerator tells you how many of those numbers you have. Okay? That's it. Easy. That's how you think about fractions. Now, when it comes to adding fractions, it's like adding any other number. The only thing you want to make sure is that you're adding numbers of the same size. So for example, whole numbers are numbers of the same size. They're whole, right? What is a whole? A whole is whatever you decide it is. It could be a whole pizza, it could be a whole shoe, whatever it is that you decide to be a whole. When you're adding whole numbers, you can add them up any way you like to because they're the same kind of number. They're whole numbers, right? So 2 plus 3 is 5. 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 2 is 4. You know, you can add whole numbers and you can add those up the way how you're used to thinking about numbers, because those numbers are the same types of numbers. They're numbers of the same size. What size are they? They're whole numbers. Now fractions are a little bit different from whole numbers because fractions can have different sizes. For example, the fraction 1/3, the size of that fraction it's 3 times smaller than the number 1. Whereas the fraction 1/4, 1 divided by 4, that is 4 times smaller than the number 1. So you can't just add the numerators and say, well, 1 plus 1 is 2, because Well, no, you're adding different numbers of different size. And you have to add numbers of the same size. So that's the key to adding fractions. So let's take a look at what I mean by adding fractions, adding numbers of the same size. Okay? If you have 1 plus 2, that's equals to 3. And I can do that because 1 is a whole number, 2, that's a whole number. So they're numbers of the same size, so I can add them together. 2 plus 1 is 3, okay? If I have 1 third plus 2 third, and here I have 1 third plus 2 thirds, look, it's the same thing. It's the same like adding 1 plus 2, because here, these two numbers are of the same size. This number here is 3 times smaller than 1, and I have one of them. This number here is 3 times smaller than 1, and I have 2 of them. So I'm adding numbers of the same size. Here I have 1 third, and here I have 2 thirds. So that gives me 3 thirds, right? Okay, and 3 divided by 3 is just equal to 1, right? So that equals 1. You see? So that shows you a fraction. Fractions and whole numbers are basically, they're no different from each other. You add them the same way. The only catch is that you just have to make sure that you're adding the same type of number. Okay, here I was adding whole numbers. Here I was adding thirds. And what are thirds? Thirds are just a number that is 3 times smaller than 1. Now, what if I add fractions that are of different size? So for example, if I add 1 half plus 1/4. What would that give me? Well, here, these two numbers are not the same size. This number is 2 times smaller than 1. This number is 4 times smaller than 1. So I'm not adding the same size numbers. I can't just go 1 plus 1, right? So what do we do in these cases? Well, we break down these numbers even more into same sizes. So I'm going to break 1/2 down into a certain size, and I'm going to break 1/4 down into the same size. Once I break these two numbers down into the same size, then I can add them together. Well, what you want to do is you want to find a common denominator. So this denominator here is 2, this is 4. So you're looking for a number that 2 goes into and 4 goes into. So you can just start with your 2 times table. All right, 2 times 1 is 2, 4 doesn't go into 2, 2 times 2 is 4, does 4 goes into 4? Yep, so there's your common denominator, easy, 4. I want my common denominator to be 4, I'm gonna break these down into fourths, and this one is already in the size of 4. This one is already broken down into fourths, and I need to break this one down into fourths. How do I do that? Well, I just multiply by, what number would turn 2 into 4? 2, right? So I multiply by 2. But I also have to put a 2 up here, right? And multiply. Since I want this denominator to be 4, I'm going to multiply by 2 divided by 2. Because 2 divided by 2 is just equal to 1. So if I'm multiplying this fraction by 1, am I changing that fraction? No, I'm not changing the fraction. I'm leaving the fraction as 1/2. This is still 1/2, right? Because 2 over 2 is just 1. So I'm just multiplying it by 1. And whenever you multiply any number times 1, did you change that number? No, you get back the same number, right? Because multiplying by 1 is an identity process. Now we're ready to proceed down. So how do you multiply fractions? You just multiply the numerators and you multiply the denominators. So up top, the numerator, you got 2 times 1 is just 2. On the bottom, you have 2 times 2, which is 4. Right? And then you bring down the plus 1 over 4. All right, now I'm dealing with numbers of the same size. This number is 4 times smaller than 1, and I have 2 of them. And this number is 4 times smaller than 1, and I have 1 of them. So how many of these numbers that are 4 times smaller than 1 do I have? I have 3. And that tells me that it's equal to 3/4. All right, easy. Now, let's talk some more about multiplying fraction. Okay, so when it comes to multiplying fraction, all you got to do is just go back to what the fraction means that we discussed earlier, right? Because let's say you have the fraction 1/4. Remember, what was 1/4? 1/4 is a number that is 4 times smaller than 1. So whenever you multiply 1/4 times a number, your answer is going to be a number that is 4 times smaller than that number. The same relationship that 1/4 has to 1 is the same relationship that 1/4 is going to have to any other number. So basically, what does that mean? It means you're just dividing. So your denominator is your divider. Your numerator is a multiplying number. You multiply by the numerator and you divide by the denominator. So let's take 3/4 times 8. 3/4 times 8. Now remember, whole numbers, they have a denominator too. The number 8 is just equal to 8 over 1. Now you can write that if you want to. For whole numbers, the denominator is 1. When you multiply this, what do you get? You get 8 times 3, which is 24, divided by 4 times 1, which is 4. And 4 goes into 24. 24 divided by 4 is equal to what? 6, right? So that's how you multiply fractions, right? And you could have done it, and you could have done this a different way. Because remember, if you have 3/4 times 8, 4 is in the denominator, so 4 is a divider. 3 is in the numerator, so 3 is a multiplier. So since 4 is a divider, you can do 8 divided by 4, which equals what? 2, right? So the 4 becomes a 1 and the 8 becomes a 2, right? Because 8 divided by 4 is 2. So you can just turn this 8 over 4 into 2, and then you have 3 times 2, which equals 6. So you could have done it that way. So it doesn't matter. So you just have to know, oh, if it's in the denominator, if I'm multiplying a fraction, the denominator is a divider, it divides into the number, and the numerator is a multiplier, it multiplies into the number. Easy. So now let's talk about dividing by a fraction. Well, when you divide by a fraction, basically remember, division is the inverse of multiplication, and multiplication is the inverse of division. By inverse of each other, what that means is that they undo each other. They're the opposite of each other. So if you multiply by 1/4, for example, that will give you a number that is 4 times smaller than your original number, right? So if you have like the number 8 and you multiply by 1/4, you get 2, right? 1/4 times 8 equals 2. Now, what if you divide by 1/4? Well, remember, division and multiplication are opposites. When you multiply by 1/4, you ended up dividing by 4. So if you're going to divide by 1/4, what are you going to do? What's the opposite of dividing? Multiplying. So you're going to end up multiplying by 4. All right? So if you have 8 divided by 1/4, so here you're not multiplying by 1/4, you're dividing by 1/4. So what do? You just do the opposite. So dividing by 1/4 is the same as multiplying by 4. So that's just 8 times 4, which equals 32. All right. So when it comes to dividing by a fraction, all you got to do is flip the fraction and change the sign to the inverse sign. So this was you're dividing, so this was a division here. So you just change that to a multiplication and you flip the fraction. So if you were dividing by 4, so dividing by 1/4 is the same as multiplying by 4. And that's how you divide by fractions. All right, so yeah, let me know if that makes sense to you guys. Especially if you're a beginner, you definitely don't want to just follow rules. You actually want to think about why you're doing what you're doing, and you definitely want to have a more intuitive understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing. Okay, so don't just follow rules, ask questions, make sure that it makes sense to you, and keep learning. If you guys enjoyed the video, go ahead, subscribe to the channel. Give me a like there in the bottom. And as always, keep learning. Be easy. Thank you.